Hello Americans channel. This video is made by free videos from Storyblocks, and these images and video we use just for explanation, and it's free use also.
This man bought a secondhand car at auction. It drove fine and the price was a bargain. Shortly after the purchase, he found out that the vehicle was an old police car. It was a surprise, but no deal breaker. But when he looked inside the door panel, he found something that made his skin turn pale. Man buys police car at auction, then he finds this in the door. When Matthew's old car broke down, he was heartbroken. It was the car he got from his father, the vehicle he grew up with, and the car in which he learned to drive. But after years of loyal service, it finally gave up on him. Matthew and his father brought the car to the junkyard together, but both agreed that Matthew needed a new one ASAP. That's when this bizarre came into play. Matthew went online and searched for secondhand cars for the entirety of that evening, eventually landing on a police auction. It was a place where confiscated and impounded vehicles were auctioned off after the original owner failed to make payment. The value of the vehicles was tempting since it lay much lower than that of other auction houses. Yet most cars there had seen better days, but one caught Matthew's eye. Police auctions weren't on Matthew's radar until that evening, but he quickly became intrigued by the concept. These cars had stories, seized from criminals or abandoned by their owners and now waiting for a new purpose. The idea of finding a hidden gem excited him, especially with the promise of such low prices. He clicked through the listings, his curiosity growing with each new vehicle he uncovered. The more Matthew explored, the more his imagination wandered. Were these cars ever involved in dramatic chases? Did they have secrets stashed within them? He laughed at his thoughts, but couldn't deny the thrill. The prices, too, were hard to ignore, far lower than anything he'd seen at other auctions. Still, he couldn't help but wonder what made these vehicles so cheap. Something about it all felt like an adventure. Among the rows of dented vans and worn-out SUVs, Matthew's eyes caught a sleek black sedan. Its polished surface gleamed in the auction photo, standing out like a diamond among rocks. It wasn't flashy, but it had an elegance that hinted at careful maintenance. Matthew leaned closer to his screen, scrutinizing every detail. A strange feeling settled in his chest. His car was different, and he felt drawn to it. Then Matthew saw the price, and his heart skipped a beat. It was impossibly low, even for a second-hand car. He reread the listing, searching for any mention of damage or mechanical issues, but found none. Was this a hidden gem or a potential disaster? He shook off the doubt. The more he stared at the listing, the more he felt this was the deal he couldn't afford to miss. Matthew wasted no time making a plan. He checked the auction's terms and conditions, noting the date and location of the lot. He ensured he had the necessary paperwork in order, mentally rehearsing how he'd inspect the car. As excitement built, he pictured himself driving the sedan home. The idea filled him with a mix of nerves and anticipation. Tomorrow couldn't come fast enough. He was ready to claim his prize. He took a public transport bus to the impound lot and felt excitement as he entered the property. He was 35 years old, but in a way, this would be the first car he owned himself. He walked around the impound and scanned the rusty old vehicles for the one that was going to be his, and after a few minutes, he spotted the car. "What a beauty," Matthew said, smiling. The sedan looked great, but at that time, Matthew wasn't aware of the huge secret the car held. Matthew inched closer, and right before he reached the car, the lot's owner came out of his quarters and called out to him. "Can I help you, sir?" were his welcoming words. Matthew introduced himself and stated his intentions. "I have an interest in this car, mister. Do you mind if I take a look?" The impound lot wasn't what Matthew expected. Rows of rusting vehicles greeted him, their surfaces dull under the morning sun. Some cars sat on flat tires, while others had broken windows or missing parts. Still, he walked with determination, scanning each row carefully. He felt a twinge of nervousness, wondering if the sedan would live up to his hopes or if it was just another battered relic. Matthew checked the printed listing one last time, making sure he remembered the car's location. Row after row, he searched for the vehicle, brushing past cars that had clearly seen better days. Finally, his eyes locked onto the familiar black sedan. Even from a distance, it looked out of place, sleek and polished among the worn-out heaps. His heart raced as he approached, already imagining the feel of its steering wheel. Standing just a few feet away, Matthew let out a low whistle. The sedan was every bit as impressive as it had looked in the photos. The black paint shimmered faintly, and while it wasn't flawless, it was leagues ahead of the other vehicles. He circled it slowly, taking in the car's profile. The shape was sturdy, but stylish, and he couldn't help but feel that it was calling out to him. Matthew crouched to inspect the tires, then straightened to peer through the windows. The interior looked clean with no obvious signs of damage. The more he looked, the more questions filled his mind. Why was such a well-kept car here? What had happened to its previous owner? A small part of him worried there might be a catch, but his excitement drowned out his doubts. This could really be the one. Just as Matthew stepped back, a voice called out to him from the lot's small office. Turning, he saw a man in a grease-stained jacket, waving a hand in greeting. "You must be here for the auction," the man said, walking over with a clipboard. Matthew nodded, introducing himself. The lot owner gestured toward the sedan. "She's a beauty, isn't she? You've got a good eye." Matthew smiled, feeling more confident. The impound owner obliged and got the keys to the vehicle from his office. He opened the car doors, showed Matthew the inside, and pointed at the gauges. "It hardly has any mileage on it," the lot owner said while sipping his morning coffee. Matthew looked around the inside and under the bonnet and didn't understand why this car was being sold for this cheap price. "What's wrong with it?" The owner said the car was fine as far as he could tell. He explained that he wasn't the official owner of any vehicle on his lot. He just managed the grounds they stood on, so he could only speak about the car's condition after it arrived. "But it seems fine," the man said. "Mechanically, this would turn out to be true." But Matthew did not know what was hidden inside the car. According to the lot owner, the car was initially set to go to demolition. It would go into a large crushing machine where it would be turned into a small metal cube, but after finding out the car's state, the lot owner couldn't just crush it. That's why he convinced the police to put the car up for auction and sell it for a soft price. "Well, I'm happy that you did," Matthew said enthusiastically. The owner explained how close the sedan had come to being destroyed. "This one was on the list for crushing," he said, shaking his head. "But I couldn't let it go. It's too nice to turn into a metal cube." He described walking past it in the yard and being struck by its condition. The decision to save it had been a gamble, but one he felt was worth taking. As Matthew listened, his curiosity about the car's past grew. The lot owner admitted he didn't know much about its history, only that it had been part of a police auction. "Sometimes these cars have been impounded, sometimes abandoned," he said. "But this one, it doesn't add up. It's clean. Too clean." Matthew nodded, the mystery only adding to the car's allure. It felt like there was more to uncover, and the lot owner mentioned how he'd checked the car's basic mechanics before deciding to sell it. Its sound. Engine, brakes, everything. If I hadn't seen the paperwork, I'd never believe this came from an impound lot. Matthew glanced at the sedan again, his interest deepening. A car this polished didn't seem like it belonged here. The idea of owning something with such a story felt more exciting by the minute. Matthew couldn't help but think about how close he'd come to missing this opportunity. If the owner hadn't taken a second look, the sedan would have been crushed, its story lost forever. "Guess it's lucky you have a good eye," Matthew said, grinning. The owner chuckled and nodded. "Sometimes you just know," he replied. Matthew felt a sense of destiny. This car had survived for a reason, and now it was calling to him. As the conversation ended, Matthew knew he was leaning toward buying the car. He had come here with an open mind, but this sedan had far exceeded his expectations. The mystery surrounding it only made it more appealing. The price was right, the conditions solid, and now it felt like fate had brought him here. He smiled to himself, already imagining what it would be like to take it home. The lot owner handed Matthew the keys, allowing him to sit inside and get a feel for the vehicle. The interior was just as clean as the outside, and the faint scent of leather filled the air. Matthew placed his hands on the steering wheel, feeling a strange sense of pride. This wasn't just any car. It was his first true choice, something he'd earned. "I think I'm ready," he said aloud. "I get a commission for every sold car you see here," the lot owner said, smiling. "So if I sell you something that is not to your liking, it will be bad for my reputation." The look on the impound owner's face, combined with his clear explanation, convinced Matthew that he was telling the truth. He bought the car without knowing its finer past details. Details that would become majorly important later. While driving home, Matthew turned on the radio and listened to soothing country music. Even the radio works perfectly, Matthew said happily. But during the trip, something happened he did not expect. A rattling sound kept appearing from within the car. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the music like glass. Perhaps it's from standing still for so long, he thought. But he would soon find out it was much more sinister. Matthew drove the car into his garage and decided to investigate his new purchase further. He was still happy with the buy, although the sound bothered him. At first, he figured that the problem must have been underneath the hood of the car. Maybe a bolt was loose somewhere and the engine's vibration made it rattle. But after popping the hood and conducting a quick inspection, Matthew found nothing out of the ordinary. After that, Matthew expanded the search to the inside of the car. He looked at the dashboard and checked the space underneath the car seats, but again, nothing. The car was immaculately clean. Finally, Matthew studied the paint job of his second-hand sedan. The coat paint on the car seemed fine at first. Next to the split where the driver's door met the back passenger door, a tiny bit of paint had come off. It wasn't much, and it wasn't something that Matthew would complain about. The car was cheap after all. But when the young man crouched down and looked a bit closer, Matthew saw something peculiar. There was another paint job underneath the top coat, and this layer of paint would raise some questions. The paint job intrigued him, so he walked to his workbench and got a paint scraper. What he did next might hurt some car enthusiasts. But Matthew wanted to paint his car a different color anyway. Matthew crouched beside the car, running his fingers over the scratched paint. The faint outline of something underneath the top layer intrigued him. He grabbed the scraper, feeling a mix of excitement and hesitation. What if he uncovered something unpleasant? But curiosity won out. Matthew sat the scraper against the side panel and carefully scratched it. Slowly, the paint began to peel away the top coat, wincing as the sharp sound echoed in his quiet garage. The sound was awful to his ears, making a high-pitched noise that made Matthew stop and pause multiple times. But the more Matthew dug in, the more he noticed he was making good progress. As the paint flaked away, Matthew revealed part of a golden letter, a bold P. He froze, staring at the shimmering color underneath. It wasn't just paint. It was something significant. His mind raced. What could it mean? Was this car part of something bigger? He resumed scraping, more urgently this time, his pulse quickening as the rest of the hidden emblem began to take shape. His hidden emblem, the golden P, turned into the start of a full word as Matthew continued his work. Piece by piece, the layers of black paint fell away, uncovering what appeared to be part of an insignia. Then he saw it. A star emblem, unmistakably tied to the police force. Matthew leaned back, stunned. He couldn't believe it. This car had once been a police. Matthew's mind raced as he stood back to admire his discovery. A police car? That explained its pristine condition, but it raised more questions than answers. Why was it repainted? Why had it been sent to auction? A deep unease settled over him. He wondered if this car carried more than just a badge. It might have a history that no one wanted uncovered. Despite his growing concern, Matthew felt compelled to dig deeper. The revelation of the police insignia was only the beginning. If this car had been part of the force, what stories might it hold? He crouched down again, examining every inch of the paintwork for clues. He hadn't expected this level of mystery when he bought the sedan, but now he couldn't stop himself from uncovering the truth. Matthew took a step back because he immediately realized what this car actually was. This is not just a normal sedan. This is a police vehicle, Matthew said with a clear sound of shock in his voice. Matthew wanted to be 100% sure about this thought, so he crouched down again and scratched the paint some more. And as expected, the golden star emblem of the police force was quickly revealed. This car just became a whole lot more interesting. The fact that he just bought a police car sends a rush of adrenaline through Matthew's body. Not many people could say the same thing about their first car. But that excitement would fade after Matthew thoroughly searched the inside of the car. Because the rattling noise he was looking for was located there, And once he found it, it made him gasp for air. After the initial adrenaline of Matthew's discovery died down a bit, he opened the door seat and took a seat inside. Matthew proudly sat behind the steering wheel of his new purchase, liking that his car had a story. But his smile faded once he closed the car door. When he did, the rattling sound immediately appeared again. Matthew realized that the annoying sound was coming from within the door panel. What is it? Matthew leaned back in the driver's seat, closing the door firmly. Almost immediately, the rattling noise began again. It was faint, barely louder than a whisper, but now that he was listening for it, the sound was impossible to ignore. His curiosity flared. What could be causing it? He tapped the door panel lightly, and the sound changed pitch, confirming that it was coming from inside the frame. Determined to solve the mystery, Matthew opened the door again and knelt beside it. He ran his fingers along the edges, pressing gently to see if anything shifted. The rattling sound seemed to respond, as if something was lodged deep inside. It didn't feel loose enough to fall out on its own. He realized he'd need tools to get to the source of the noise and uncover what was hiding inside. Matthew grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the small gaps around the door panel. The beam revealed nothing but dust and metal at first, but the faint rattling sound persisted. He sighed, realizing he would have to remove the entire panel to get a better look. Why couldn't this just be a loose screw? He muttered to himself as he reached for his toolbox and screwdriver. Working carefully, Matthew loosened the screws around the edge of the door. With each turn, his anticipation grew. What could possibly be inside? A forgotten tool? Maybe an old piece of wiring? He tugged at the panel, but it didn't come loose easily. After a few minutes of wiggling and prying, the cover finally popped off, revealing a narrow, dusty compartment. Matthew held his breath as he shone his flashlight inside. At first, all Matthew saw was an empty cavity. Disappointed, he was about to set his tools aside when the light caught something reflective. It was faint and partially hidden, but definitely there. He leaned closer, squinting to make out the shape. It looked like a small plastic bag wedged tightly into the space. His heart pounded as he reached in carefully, his fingers brushing against the mysterious object. The bag wouldn't budge easily. Matthew tugged gently, trying not to tear the plastic. Whatever was inside felt solid but oddly shaped. After a few tense moments, he gave a final pull, and the bag came free with a soft rustling sound. Matthew sat back on his heels, staring at it. The translucent plastic revealed faint outlines of objects within, but nothing that immediately made sense. Matthew's hands trembled slightly as he held the bag. What on earth is this? He whispered to himself. He turned it over slowly, trying to identify the items through the cloudy plastic. He could make out a hard rectangular shape and what appeared to be a bundle of smaller objects. His mind raced with possibilities, each one more bizarre than the last. Whatever it was important enough to hide. Matthew stared at the bag, debating his next move. Should he open it? A part of him wanted to call the police immediately, but another part was desperate to know what he'd found. He felt like he was at the edge of a major discovery, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. Taking a deep breath, he decided to unravel the mystery himself. Just one peek wouldn't hurt, right? Matthew was curious but didn't want to take the entire car apart to find out, so that's when he tried the next best thing. He called the local police department for answers. Go to the source, the place where the car originated from, Matthew said proudly, feeling like a true Sherlock Holmes at that point. But when he called the local police department, he did not get the answer he sought. The phone rang a couple of times and then a local law enforcer picked up. Police department, how may I help you? He heard through his phone. Matthew answered and explained the situation of the refinished paint job and the police emblem he found underneath. He talked about the rattling sound inside the car and told them he had located it inside the door panel. The policeman, however, stopped him halfway through his story. After hearing most of Matthew's story, the officer sounded confused. I'm sorry, sir, repainted, you say? The officer said. He confirmed that the department did bring older police cars to that lot for demolition. It didn't happen often, but it was possible. But repainting police cars and reselling them was something they never did. That would cause major problems for the department because it puts police vehicles in the hands of civilians. The policeman questioned the validity of Matthew's story, but Matthew knew for sure, and he had the means to prove it. Matthew had already scratched off enough of the paint to read the precinct number in its entirety. He got out of his seat and recited every number, hearing the officer's worried voice while he did. That's when an eerie feeling crept up on him. Did the impound owner scam him after all? The policeman asked for the license plate number to find out more information about the vehicle. Matthew obliged and gave the number to the officer. The officer was busy looking through the police database. Matthew could tell because the clicking sound of his keyboard was heard through the phone connection. But that paint job was just a part of the equation because Matthew was about to ask the most important question of all. While Officer Henry looked up the license plate of the mysterious vehicle, Matthew asked the question that actually bothered him the most. He told the officer again about the rattling sound in the door frame and asked if police cars had something built in there that could have come loose. It was a logical thing to ask, and I hoped for a simple answer. But the truth behind this rattle was shocking for both parties. He put the officer on speaker while gazing at the door panel closer. The officer said he didn't know of any objects being placed inside the door frames. "They're just doors, sir," he said. But the officer did find out something else. While Matthew started pulling on the plastic cover of the door, the officer stated that he found the car's former owner through their license plate system. That's interesting. The car belonged to a former cop, an officer who worked in this district not that long ago. Officer Henry even stated that the name of this man sounded familiar. Matthew listened to the information presented by Officer Henry, but was mainly focused on what was right in front of him. He felt it around with a screwdriver in the side panel of the door, and then the front casing just popped off. The panel fell to the ground, revealing the bare metal door behind it. According to Officer Henry, there wasn't supposed to be anything between the panel and the door. But Matthew instantly saw something that did not belong there. It was a translucent plastic, and there appeared to be something inside of it. Matthew grabbed the bag with both hands and started pulling. The bag was nudged in there pretty tightly, but after a few hard pulls, Matthew released the bag from the door's tight grip. Officer Henry was still on the speaker and was curious to know what Matthew had found. "What is it? What's in the bag?" Matthew said that he couldn't tell from the outside. The young man placed the bag on his lap and slowly unfolded it. Both men held their breath as Matthew opened the top. Matthew was calm up until that point, but when he reached inside and pulled out the contents, his face turned pale instantly, and for good reasons. Inside this bag were a gun, a tape recorder, and Polaroid pictures that showed the most horrific scene Matthew had ever seen in his entire life. "What the hell?" he shouted. Matthew's fright loosened the grip, and he almost dropped the gun on his garage floor. The officer was still on speaker and heard Matthew's breathing change significantly. "What is going on there, sir?" the policeman asked. Matthew explained that he found a bag and told the officer about the contents inside. The gun and the tape recorder were scary enough on their own. But what really shocked Matthew was the Polaroid pictures. They showed a bank building and a deceased person lying in front of it. "Is there blood on these pictures? So much blood," Matthew screamed through his phone, forgetting it was still on speaker. "Calm down, sir," Officer Henry requested through the phone as Matthew's scream caused a beep in his ears. "Is there blood seen on the pictures, or is there blood attached to the picture itself?" Matthew replied and said that both were the case. That's when things took a dark turn. Matthew did not even bother with the gun. He didn't want his fingerprints anywhere near that thing. When getting it out of the bag, he had already touched the weapon once, and that was enough. Matthew saw enough crime documentaries to know that fingerprints on a gun could lead to an arrest, even if you didn't even do a thing. The tape recorder, however, he did dare to touch again. The tape recorder now lay on Matthew's lap. Using the bag as a barrier between his finger and the object, he pressed play. What the young man heard next was so crazy that his jaw literally dropped. A full confession was given by the person who robbed the bank in the picture. It was supposed to go down as a simple heist, but things got complicated, and a civilian casualty was made. Matthew's call started as a routine check for Officer Henry, who was still on the speaker dial. But after hearing the tape and learning about the contents of that bag, the officer took this case much more seriously. The man in uniform told Matthew to stay put. "I already informed 2 of my colleagues, and they are on their way right now," Henry panicked. "What have I gotten myself into?" Officer Henry calmed Matthew down and said that he had nothing to worry about if he was innocent. After that, the conversation ended and a nervous wait started for Matthew. He put down the phone and looked at the bizarre bag hiding inside his newly bought car. What had he gotten himself into? He just needed a car, not all this hassle. He hoped that he would not be seen as a suspect after this. Matthew's thoughts ran back to the place where he bought the car. Was the impound lot owner the prime suspect? It was hard to believe that this simple-looking man was a criminal and a murderer. "What the hell is going on?" Matthew screamed from the top of his lungs. This entire investigation was getting a bit too much for Matthew. And then the patrolling police car arrived. Two tall, broad, uniformed men stepped out of the police car and approached Matthew, who was crying at that point. They acknowledged his presence and asked if he was all right. These comforting words were just out of politeness, though, because pretty much immediately after, they asked for the bag of evidence. Matthew asked if they knew more, and they replied by saying that they had found a lead to the car's former owner. But first things first, we have to go to the place where you bought the vehicle, sir. The officer said they needed to talk to the impound owner. If his story matches yours, we can clear your name, the policeman said. Matthew asked why they needed extra confirmation. This seemed a clear case, after all. They even got a confession on tape. The officer replied, "Because the original owner's identity is a delicate matter, sir." Matthew was ordered to come with them to the compound. Matthew doubted they saw him as a suspect, but he did not feel safe either. The person who owned this car before him was a policeman too, and he turned out to be a criminal. So Matthew did not know who to trust. Driving up the property, they were greeted by the owner from before. The overseer recognized Matthew instantly and waved, smiling. But that smile quickly faded after the police explained the disturbing situation involving the car from his lot. They said that the car was a police vehicle and that it potentially belonged to a criminal. The lot owner was shocked by this revelation and swore he knew nothing about this mess. As the policemen interrogated the owner, they analyzed the man's facial movements the entire time to see if he was lying. Matthew did the same, but for a different reason. He needed the man's story to add up to his own so the police could clear him as a suspect, and luckily for Matthew, it did. But that wasn't all, because the car park owner gave the police the final evidence they needed, the one thing that tied it all together. A cop brought it by. He said that the car was intended for demolition. The officers listened intently as the lot owner recounted how the car came into his possession. His voice was steady, but there was a hint of nervousness as he described the day the vehicle was delivered. "It was just another car to me at the time," he admitted. The officers exchanged glances, their growing interest in the case apparent. Matthew remained silent, hoping this would all work in his favor. The lot owner produced a file, flipping through pages before landing on the one tied to Matthew's car. He handed it to the officers, pointing out a signature and date. "That's the cop who brought it here," he said firmly. The lead officer nodded, taking down notes. Matthew watched closely, sensing the gravity of the situation. It was clear now. This car wasn't just a police vehicle, it was part of something bigger. The officers explained that they were already familiar with the name on the document. "He's no longer with the force," one of them said grimly. Matthew's stomach churned as they revealed that this officer had abruptly resigned following an unsolved bank robbery. The pieces were starting to fall into place. The car wasn't just a vehicle. It was evidence in a crime that had left investigators baffled for months. As the officers pieced together the timeline, the atmosphere in the room grew heavier. "This explains so much," one of them murmured, his pen racing across his notepad. Matthew couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and dread. On one hand, his innocence was becoming clearer. On the other, he was now deeply entangled in a case that seemed more sinister with every new detail. Matthew shifted uncomfortably as the officers debated their next steps. The room felt tense, almost suffocating. He couldn't shake the feeling that this discovery had changed the stakes for everyone involved. The officers decided they needed to act quickly, calling in additional support to investigate further. Matthew's role in the case wasn't over, and he could sense the weight of responsibility growing heavier on his shoulders. He went to bed, thinking his life was over. The officers turned their attention back to the bag Matthew had found in the door panel. It was the missing piece they needed to tie everything together. "This bag could contain crucial evidence," one of them said, carefully examining the contents without disturbing them. Matthew watched as they cataloged each item. The weight of what he had uncovered sank in. This wasn't just an odd discovery. It was the key to solving a major crime. With the evidence in hand, the officers were confident they could track down the former officer involved in the case. "This changes everything," one said, his tone resolute. They thanked Matthew for his cooperation and reassured him that his actions had been instrumental. For the first time, Matthew felt a sense of relief. He had stumbled into a mystery far bigger than himself, and now it was on its way to resolution. As the officers prepared to leave, Matthew sat in silence, processing everything that had unfolded. What had started as an ordinary car purchase had turned into something extraordinary. He couldn't help but wonder about the twists of fate that had brought him here. The mystery wasn't fully solved yet, but he felt proud to have played a part in uncovering the truth. It was a story he would never forget. And it's not. The impound owner wobbled back to his office and asked the policeman and Matthew to follow him there. "Inside my office, I have all the documentation of cars I own, so maybe your suspect is in there as well." He reached into a filing cabinet and ruffled through some documents. After a while, he stopped and pulled out a thin file. The man opened it up and pointed at the autograph at the bottom. "This is the autograph of the man who brought the car in. I have all car donors sign a legal document after storing a vehicle here," the owner said proudly. The man smiled, knowing he had done something to help the policeman, but he had no idea how much he had just helped them. This was the missing link. "We've got him," the officers grunted. And that's when they explained the entire situation. They told the car park owner and Matthew that the man to whom this car, the tape, and the gun were registered was a cop in their own precinct. Matthew saw the lip of the agent quiver, indicating that anger was raging inside his body. "He was one of our own! How could he do this?" the policeman said, while banging his hand on the desk in front of him. They then explained that this particular policeman no longer worked at the precinct. He quit a few months ago, right after his last case. And when Matthew heard what this case was about, he felt his stomach turn. He was assigned to a local bank robbery, and after he finished the job, he quit the very next day. But now we know why, because the man himself was the robber. "It all makes sense now," the officer said. The cop tried to explain why this was the case. He said that the bank robbery was a big deal within the force when it happened. Most robberies did not end in bloodshed, and when this one did, there was one person who immediately claimed the case for himself. And now we know why, because that person is now our prime. The policeman remembered the day that his colleague took this case very vividly. It wasn't like everyone was gunning to get the case assigned or anything, so the fact that this officer wanted it so badly seemed odd. We didn't think much of it back then, so the moment faded from memory. But in hindsight, we should have paid closer attention to his actions because he assigned himself with only one goal in mind. The officers recounted how the bank robbery case had unfolded. The former cop, now their prime suspect, had insisted on taking the lead. "It was odd," one officer said. "He practically fought for it." At the time, they thought his eagerness was due to ambition or a sense of duty. Now it was clear that his motives had been anything but noble. The dots were finally starting to connect. The suspect's actions during the investigation were meticulously calculated. He had worked quickly, collecting evidence and securing the crime scene with minimal involvement from others. He kept everyone at arm's length, another officer added. It's obvious now he wanted full control. The officers explained how the man's actions had initially seemed professional, but looking back, they saw them for what they were: a calculated attempt to cover his tracks. The suspect's connection to the car was undeniable. The officers explained that the sedan had been part of the investigation but was mysteriously written off as surplus and sent to auction. "He must have thought it was the perfect way to hide the evidence," one officer said. Matthew listened intently, realizing just how deep the deception ran. This wasn't just a car, it was the linchpin in a carefully orchestrated crime. When the suspect saw the car on the news, panic must have set in. The officer speculated that he had assumed the vehicle had been destroyed. Seeing it in public again would have shattered his plan, they explained. His decision to break into the impound lot was born out of desperation, a last-ditch effort to eliminate the remaining evidence before it could incriminate him. It was a fatal misstep. The officers detailed their ambush plan, explaining how they'd prepared for every possible scenario. "We knew he'd come back for the car," one said confidently. They had stationed themselves strategically around the lot, ready to strike the moment the suspect showed up. It wasn't just about catching him, the officer added. It was about ensuring he couldn't destroy the evidence. Matthew listened, silently marveling at how it had all come together. He assigned himself to get rid of the evidence. That's why he repainted the car. More importantly, that was why he wanted the vehicle demolished in the first place. The evidence would have also been destroyed if the car had been crushed into a cube like it was supposed to, and by painting the car beforehand, he already clouded the police aspect of this case, making it easier for him to slip away. Matthew couldn't believe it. It angered him that an officer of the law would do such a heinous thing, and he felt that it was meant to be that he was the one to eventually buy the car, reopen this case. The Bears case had hold. We already in the filing system for unsolved cases, but with this new discovery, it was wide open again. "We have to catch him," Matthew said with determination in his voice. "But how do we proceed from here?" The officers looked at Matthew with a serious face and smiled confidently. The suspension in the air was palpable, and both Matthew and the impound owner wondered what the officer was about to say. "I have a plan," the man in uniform proclaimed, but the cop also said he needed their help to make it work. The policeman asked the car park owner if they could park the vehicle back in the lot for a brief moment. The owner agreed and asked why this was necessary. The police stated that it was all important that the car would return here because that would lure out the criminal cop for sure. "We are going to send out a news report and mention the involvement of his police car." The officers explained their strategy to Matthew and the lot owner. The car would be returned to the exact spot it was found, visible but unguarded to the untrained eye. "It has to look natural," one officer said. They would then position themselves in hidden vantage points across the lot, ready to act when the suspect inevitably came to retrieve the evidence he thought was safe. The lot owner hesitated at first, uneasy about playing a role in such a high-stakes operation. "Are you sure this will work?" he asked, glancing nervously at the officers. They reassured him that every detail had been carefully planned. "It's risky, yes," another officer admitted, "but we're confident he'll take the bait." Matthew, standing nearby, could feel the tension rising. He knew there was no turning back now. To set the plan in motion, the officers released a short news report featuring the car. The clip showed it parked in the lot with an appeal for tips from the public. "We're not expecting tips," one officer whispered to Matthew after the segment aired. "We're expecting him." The report aired that evening, and everyone involved braced for what they hoped would be the suspect's next move. With the car in place and the lot under surveillance, the waiting began. Hours ticked by, the tension in the air thick enough to cut. Matthew stayed at a distance but couldn't help feeling anxious. The officers remained focused, scanning the lot for any sign of movement. "He'll come," one officer said firmly, his eyes never leaving the shadows. "He doesn't have a choice." It was all part of their plan. They would show the car in the news report and ask for tips. But they knew that if the culprit saw his car on the news, he would panic. If our former colleague sees his car, he would want to return to the impound lot to get rid of the evidence once and for all. And that's what we hope for, because then we can place an ambush. All men agreed, and the plan was set in motion. The car was placed back into the impound, and a short video of the vehicle hit news stations the very same day. After that, all they had to do was wait for the shady cop to grab the bait. And surely enough, their plan worked to perfection, because the very next night, the lot was broken into by an unknown man, unknown to the camera, who only saw a man in a black mask. But the police team knew better. This was the corrupt cop for sure. He entered the property by cutting the fence open, thinking the coast was clear. But secretly, the policemen were also on the property, waiting for the man to slip up. The squad team saw how the figure navigated the lot, looking for his car. Once he located the car, he thought it would be an easy mission, just grab the evidence from the car door and leave without being seen. But the criminal made a huge error in acting this impulsively. Before the man knew it, over 20 police officers had jumped out of the shadows and surrounded their former colleague. The cold case was reopened, and it was finally time to close it. "We've got him!" The culprit was arrested on the spot and was placed in the back of a police car, the same model he was trying to get rid of himself. The irony, one of the officers even said aloud as he pushed the man's head through the doorframe. Matthew, unfortunately, was not allowed to go along with the police during this bust. That would have been too dangerous. But the young man wouldn't miss a thing. Because of the magnitude of this case, the entire thing was televised, and Matthew could follow every part of the arrest during a live feed on the news. He was happy to see the man being escorted into the station in handcuffs. Justice had prevailed, but there was still one problem. Now, this was all over. He still did not have a car. But the police came to his aid on that part. And that aid came in the form of a letter Matthew received just a few days later. It was early morning on a Saturday when Matthew heard the front mailbox. The metal flap was still moving, making a rattling sound indicating that something had fallen through. As the young man approached the front door, he saw a letter on the mat. It looked official, so Matthew opened it up curiously. Matthew was sipping his morning coffee when he heard the clatter of his mailbox. He set the mug down and walked to the door, spotting a crisp, official-looking envelope on the mat. His name and address were neatly typed on the front. Intrigued, he tore it open, his heart racing as he unfolded the letter. The words at the top read, "From the local police department." The letter began with a formal thank you for Matthew's role in the recent investigation. It acknowledged his quick thinking and cooperation, stating that his actions had directly contributed to solving a significant case. "Your bravery and determination are commendable," it read. Matthew couldn't help but smile, feeling a sense of pride. He had never imagined that buying a car would lead to such an acknowledgement from the police. The letter didn't just thank Matthew, it included an invitation. He was asked to visit the station that afternoon to meet the officers who had worked on the case. "We would also like to offer a small token of our appreciation," the letter concluded. Matthew's curiosity grew. What could this reward be? He quickly finished his coffee, feeling a new sense of anticipation as he got ready to head out. When Matthew arrived at the station, he was greeted with applause. Nearly every officer involved in the case was there, clapping and smiling as he walked in. "Here he is, the man who cracked the case," someone called out. Matthew's cheeks flushed as he nodded in thanks. The warm reception was overwhelming, and for the first time, he felt like a real hero.